I'm Karen Giannoni. You're watching BBC World News. Our top stories. The Russian businessman Boris Berezovsky, a former close ally and later fierce critic of President Putin, is found dead at his home near London. More protests in Cyprus as reports emerge of a possible 20% tax on large bank deposits.
And I'm Tolson Tollett. Coming up on Sport today in 15 minutes' time. Red Bull Sebastian Vettel takes pole position ahead of Sunday's Malaysian Grand Prix.
Hello. The Russian businessman and prominent critic of the Kremlin, Boris Berezovsky, has died at the age of 67. He was found dead at his home near London on Saturday morning. He'd been living here in the UK for several years after being granted political asylum. He was originally an ally of President Vladimir Putin, but relations soured soon after Mr. Putin became president. Let's go over to Moscow and speak to our correspondent, Steve Rosenberg. Steve, Boris Berezovsky, a huge figure in Russia. What's the reaction there?
Well, we've had some reaction already from President Putin's spokesman, Dmitry Peskov, who said a short while ago that the death of any person, no matter what kind of a person that was, does not create any positive emotions. Mr. Peskov, quite interestingly, said that 2 months ago, Mr. Berezovsky had sent a letter to President Putin apologizing for his mistakes that he'd made and asking to return to Russia. Mr. Peskov said that was around a couple of months ago. Also some reaction from a former Justice Minister of Russia, Pavel Krashenenikov, who's now in the Russian Parliament, claiming that it was Mr. Berezovsky who had him sacked as Justice Minister at the end of the 1990s. He was, as you say, a very controversial figure in this country. He was a mathematician, an academic, who used the collapse of the Soviet Union to strike rich and to amass enormous power. He was one of the most powerful people in Russia under Boris Yeltsin.
And Steve, what details do we have about the circumstances of Boris Berezovsky's death? Of course, he lived here in the UK, just southwest of London, in a mansion in Surrey.
We have very few details. Around an hour ago, one of the Russian news agencies reported that Mr. Berezovsky was found dead at around 11 o'clock in the morning at his home near London. But we don't know what the cause of death was. There's been speculation, of course, in the media here, but we have no firm details.
Steve, thank you very much. Steve Rosenberg in Moscow. Let's talk some more about this with Artyom List, who's the editor of the BBC's Russian service. I mean, Artyom, how much of a shock has this come as?
I'd say it's quite a big shock. Nobody was expecting Mr. Berezovsky to suddenly die. Having said that, there are already questions being asked about the circumstances of his death. I mean, Steve just said that there's very little we know at this stage. But as far as everybody was aware, he didn't have any massive serious illnesses. He wasn't a very old man. 67 is hardly a ripe old age. So there are questions being asked already, but there are very few answers yet.
Right, and so much interest in that. So many people saying he did have many enemies.
He certainly did. He survived a number of assassination attempts, the latest one about 6 years ago. And he was one of the most prominent figures in the London-based anti-Kremlin circle, let's put it this way. He was very vocal, very outspoken, very much anti-President Putin, and he hardly mingled his words.
Right, because he actually came to the UK because, under an arrangement of asylum in the UK, because of fears of about his safety.
That's right. It was in the early noughties. He came here, he claimed political asylum. He said if he were to come back to Russia, where he was, the Russian authorities were seeking him for a criminal trial, he said his life would be in danger. At the time, obviously, the British authorities granted him asylum. And
recently, I mean, he'd had a controversial last few months, a very difficult court case with Roman Abramovich, which he lost at great loss to himself financially. How much in the headlines has he been?
Quite a lot here, a lot less so in Russia.
Right.
I mean, if anything, it's because in Russia he was perhaps less important on a kind of day-to-day basis than he was as a historical figure. But as you just said, that court case, that was a massive blow to him. There are no firm details, but it's widely understood that he lost a significant proportion of his wealth. His office in central London, he moved out of that. We also understand that the security firm which provided protection for him, he ended the contract with that firm. His private jet, we understand, went on sale. So he did lose quite a lot of money. And he, of course, was not anymore the sort of massive financial figure that he used to be.
Artyom, thank you very much, editor of the BBC Russian service. I'm sure we will be talking about this a lot later. Thank you very much, Artyom Lis. Now, Yuri Fleshtinsky was a friend of Boris Berezovsky and is the author of The Putin Corporation. He says Mr. Berezovsky was still the focus of a lot of political attention in Russia.
The documentary which was produced recently was a case built against Boris Berezovsky. He was accused of several murders. He was accused of several other crimes. So they really were building a case against him, and they probably would never do it if he would play play no role at all and will have no importance for them. So they actually were interested in destroying him. Whether this destruction, came through documentary or would lead to a physical destruction, this we will see, of course, with time. But this may take some time for us to understand what actually happened.
Right, we will have more, of course, on the death of Boris Berezovsky in the forthcoming hours here on BBC World News. Let's bring you up to date with some other stories, though, around the world. Leaders in Cyprus say they have made serious progress towards a deal that will stop the island